Get ready to rumble. Schilling Show Unleashed on the Seven Thunders Media Network. Former city councilor, husband, father, and community watchdog. Your host, Rob Schilling.
Welcome to the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Remember, your direct support makes our show possible, and you can directly support this podcast by visiting shillingshow.com and then clicking on the Patreon banner at the top of the page to make a monthly contribution. We appreciate your support. I want to spend a moment thinking about things that are hollow. You know, hollow is not necessarily a bad thing. A wiffle ball is hollow. It would hurt otherwise. How about a pipe or a tube, something that carries water or liquids? A bottle that you would put something in. A drum, of course, would be hollow. How about an empty box? You can put good things in there. Those are all hollow. But do we desire to be hollow? I certainly hope not. As I reflect on our society, I wonder what happened to us. How many people these days have no friends or very few friends? Or maybe the best friend is a screen on an electronic device. There are very few social events since the onset of COVID, but even before that, people were meeting socially on their phones and devices and not in person. And of course, the common culture of America has all but disappeared. Let's look at television now. How many stations do we have on cable? We're not all watching the same shows. We can't talk about it because there are hundreds or maybe even thousands of stations to watch a television program on. Music, a lot of subgenres in music. We don't have the same American Top 40. Social media, where we have all of our various pages, there's not a lot in common. In addition, this is a country that's losing its heart by losing its faith. Many people, especially in the younger generation, are now identifying as non-religious or sometimes called nuns. In other words, we don't have any of that, and frankly, we don't want it. What happens to a nation without God? Schools that once taught us to be fearful of God and proud of our country have flipped 180 degrees. Now they're teaching vulnerable children to hate America. And you want to know what they teach about God? Well, that the government is God. It takes away from some and gives to others as the government sees fit. That there's no such thing as a boy or a girl. In fact, those terms can't even be used in many schools today, maybe even the majority of government schools in the United States of America. Think and ask yourself, are our home lives much better? When was the last time we all ate around the table as a family like we used to do back in the day when all of us were growing up? Are we distracted by devices so we're in a different world even when we're in the same room? And what about family events and milestones? Have we stopped celebrating those? Have we stopped gathering together to have common time? Our culture is under a full-blown attack. It should be obvious if we look around and spend a few moments reflecting on how things have changed in such a short time. We once had a backbone as a God-fearing nation, but that's been hollowed out too. No longer representing anything, this nation, but the pursuit of our own desires. Jeremy Adams, the author who will join us today, will report firsthand from his position as a classroom teacher on what has happened to us, and it's not pretty because we're hollowed out. The Schilling Show Unleashed podcast will continue in a moment.
BorderHawk.News is a one-stop shop with the latest news about immigration, nationalism, and globalism. The BorderHawk staff daily curates immigration news stories and, in the fashion of the Drudge Report, updates the site with cutting-edge content and original first-class commentary. BorderHawk.News highlights national and international media reports, tweets, and nuggets buried in local news blurbs, polls, video clips, and policy research. BorderHawk is pro-legal immigration, pro-rule of law, but against an unsecure border as countless Americans have suffered violence at the hands of criminal illegal aliens. And an increasing number of Americans are concerned about how mass migration affects their daily life. BorderHawk.News will remain on the forefront of the immigration issue with a buffet of info to read, evaluate, and share. Bookmark BorderHawk.News. Add them on social media at BorderHawkNews on Twitter.
Charlottesville's community watchdog, Rob
the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast, and we welcome Jeremy S. Adams, a decorated educator and author of the new book, Hollowed Out, A Warning About America's Next Generation. And Jeremy Adams, welcome to the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. I want to talk about the concept of the book, and as I look at this and I think about something that is hollowed out, Jeremy, it's just a shell of its former self, and I'd imagine in all the areas that you look at in the book, that's what we're facing.
Yeah, that's exactly right. You know, one of the things that I've gotten a lot of a response on is people seem to be very kind of shaken by the image there of children being hollowed out. But I think it's the appropriate one. And at the end of the day, I would ask most of the adults in our society to think about what are the things in your childhood that filled it in? What are the things of your life that are substantive, that make it worth living? You know, when you think of those things, you think of relationships, you think of marriages, you think of romances, you think of being a parent, you think of being a patriot, you think of being a member of a church or a faith, you think of joining an institution or a political party or some kind of cause. It goes on and on. All the things that fill us in, that give us a possibility of joy in our souls. When I start to talk to my students here in the last 5 to 10 years, what I notice is I took all those things for granted, that young people, of course, are going to date. Of course, they're going to fall in love. Of course, they're going to eventually figure out if they're, a Republican or a Democrat, and they'll join a political party. They might reject the faith of their mom and their dad, but they'll find their own. And what I've noticed, tragically, is that nothing has taken the place of these connections to other people and to other things. And instead, you see young people who are very isolated, who are very lonely. Their mental health is in crisis. And that's because it turns out when you focus largely on yourself and only yourself, it's a path to misery.
Now, this didn't happen overnight, and I think it's instructive from your own research and observation, Jeremy, as to how we got here, because we did go along for generation upon generation holding various truths to be self-evident. They seem to be gone now.
Yeah, no, this is something that did not happen overnight. But I would tell you that, there's a lot of things that you can blame on this hollowing out process. But I do think, to get a little bit deeper into, I think you have to be honest and say, well, there is this kind of intellectual milieu that our young people grow up in, and they're not even aware of it. And I think they live in this kind of postmodernism where there are no absolutes. Everything is a matter of taste and preference. It's what I would call a radical subjectivism. And so if you don't believe in kind of, an inherited wisdom, if you don't believe there's a right and a wrong, a right way to live, a wrong way to live, if you don't believe that there is, something like enlightenment or enchantment or any of these things that as young people you kind of aspire to achieve. I mean, I think a good demonstration of kind of this postmodern malaise that our young people are in is look at the way that we look at college nowadays. It's very different. So when I was growing up, you went away to college to become a better version of yourself, right? You read books because these books have eternal truths in them that you don't understand or you haven't had access to. You want to be taught by professors who have studied and experienced and have something to mold you into. And nowadays, when we look at not just college, I guess, but just education in general, it's not about taking you and allowing you to be the best version of yourself through this contact with powerful ideas and books and teachers. No. Nowadays, it's all about affirmation of you, that you're great as you are. Anybody who tries to tell you otherwise is somehow being intolerant of you. And I think that reversal really gives you a sense of why I think education has become so flat. Nobody talks about the meaning of life anymore. Have you noticed that? Nobody talks about these great transcendent ideals of beauty and truth and wisdom and valor. Nobody talks like that anymore because you have to reach for those things. And so you're right. This didn't come about overnight. And this kind of postmodernism, I really believe that the real divide in America is not a liberal conservative divide. It's a divide between people who believe that there are objective truths in the world. There's an objective moral order, and you have the freedom to attach yourself to that order or not, versus people who think that it's all kind of morally relative, and you should be able to do whatever you want to do because there is no right and there is no wrong.
Jeremy Adams, you have a very unique view because you have a view from the classroom at both the high school and the college level in your experience. I think one of the most critical issues going on right now is teacher burnout. They don't even feel like getting into a lot of these issues, just trying to get through the day. And a lot of that has to do with discipline. Tell us about your perspective as a teacher of discipline in the classroom today and what it's doing to learning.
That's a great question. Yeah, I think that teachers and parents, I would say, I would lump parents into this. One of the things I perceived as I was doing my research for the book, and I know I feel this as a teacher and as a parent, is I think a lot of us just want to raise normal, decent human beings. And we feel like we're fighting all these different powers and elements in our culture, in our country, just to do it. And you bring up, I think, the best example of that. And that is, discipline. The fact that, we used to have this view in education that I think was the right view, which is, look, if you're not being fed at home, the school is a place where you can get 3 meals a day, right? And that's actually kind of a new thing when you look at the grand scheme of things. If you're not being counseled at home, well, then, we'll give you counseling at school. Even if you're not getting the basic things, like if you have like old shoes or whatever, a school is a place where we will do the things for you when whatever your background is, it's not providing it. But for some reason, what we've done in the last 10 years, and I know why we do it, we're doing it for the right reason, but I think it's the wrong outcome. We look at these difficult backgrounds that kids come from, and we see that there's a lot of violence in the background, a lot of vulgarity, a lot of drug use. Of course, young people are going to bring those things to school with them. And because that happens to people who are disproportionately poor or minorities, there has been this movement to say, you know what? We should not punish these kinds of behaviors at the school. We need to, it's what we call restorative justice. We need to get to the root of it. We need to be much more conscious of it. And up to this point, I'm good with it. Like I do think that there's a lot of value in that. I really do. There was a really famous book a few years ago called the School to Prison Pipeline, where if you look at the studies, young people who get in trouble at school are more likely to end up in prison. And so I think there is value in not, immediately suspending a kid who uses some profanity, right? So I think there's value in that. Where I really feel like we fall off is when we say, okay, we understand you, we support you, but then we fail to understand the whole purpose of that support, which is you still have to behave, right? It's still not okay to talk like that at school. It's still not okay to be lazy. It's still not okay not to do your homework. And that pivot is the one that we have stopped making. So that, young people are smart. They know that if they can get away with A, B, and C, they will continue to do A, B, and C, and they'll probably do D, E, and F next. Because when the adults fail to be adults, when the adults don't somehow deal with correcting the bad behavior, we think that we're being nice by being infinitely tolerant. But all you're really doing, by the way, is teaching the young people what they can get away with. And let me just say this as well, and the chapter in the book deals with this. Who you're really hurting are the young kids who have the same bad situation, but they're trying hard at school. They're trying to use their education to get ahead. They want to learn. Most of these kids from difficult backgrounds behave very well, and yet you have, some of these students who are disruptive, and they stay in the classroom because we think it's compassionate, but really you're hurting the kids who are trying to do their best.
It makes total sense, and I want to bring up a parallel situation. I became aware yesterday that the governor of Oregon had signed off on a bill or on a policy that would allow people to graduate, students to graduate from Oregon high schools without achieving any of the standards that were previously in place. And so if you're just giving people a pass and saying you get a certificate and a graduation, even though you don't know how to read, what's the value of even being there in the first place?
I wish that I could say I was shocked by this, but this follows a trend. Bill de Blasio trying to end, kind of gifted and talented education in New York City. You saw a movement in California that tried to say, well, maybe we shouldn't be teaching calculus. And again, none of this is inconsistent with what we've seen the last decade, which is higher graduation rates and lower test scores. So it doesn't take a genius to figure out what's happening, which is that there's a serious pressure just to pass kids on through the system without really having much rigor that they have to meet. And I think that what you're seeing here is this notion that somehow, when you have differentiated outcomes between different groups, and I don't care if we're talking about the groups on gender or race or class or even whatever it is, that somehow that is evidence ipso facto of some form of systemic, failure towards a group. That's just simply not true. I mean, when you look at, Thomas Sowell made the famous observation, you can't really look at unequal outcomes as proof of injustice, because in a family, you can have twins who have the exact same opportunities, who live wildly different lives and have different outcomes. So the idea that you have different outcomes in society, and that's proof of unfair treatment, really is folly. But how fast our society, I would argue, has pivoted from equality of opportunity, which is always what I think probably you and I believed in as Americans, to this new kind of concept of equity, which is more focused on outcomes, that if you have unequal outcomes, then there's some kind of shenanigans happening. And I think that's what you're seeing in Oregon.
There was a part of the book that really hit me in my heart, particularly because I didn't really realize this was going on. And it's about friendship forgotten. And I think back to my own childhood, Jeremy Adams, and all the friends I had, and they were the world to me. And as you mentioned today, a lot of kids don't even have a single friend. That's terrible. That's tragic.
Yeah, when you look at the levels of loneliness, I think 1 out of 5 millennials in a famous study said they don't have a good friend in the entire world. The same thing happened in this book over and over again, which is that I would kind of talk to my students, realize there was something kind of weird from what I consider to be normal. And then you do the research and you realize it's not just my classroom. This is a countrywide phenomenon. And what I thought was really interesting about the loneliness was there's a quote in the book. It's a quote that says, loneliness is not the state of being alone. It's the state of not experiencing meaningful things with other people. So, you can be around all kinds of other people, but if you feel like you're not experiencing anything meaningful with them, you feel very lonely. And one of the things that shocked me is, I literally did research into this phenomenon, and that is that young people aren't going to football games the way that they used to. I teach at Bakersfield High School, which is about 128 years old. We have more state football championships than any other. Now, the school will not tell you that most of those championships happened in the 1920s, but we still say it because it's true. But I went to this high school. My dad taught at this high school. I've been there for 23 years. It used to be that on a Friday night, that's on a home football game, that's where you went. I mean, there was not even a thought of going somewhere else or not going there. You had the band, you had the football game, you had the rally section. There was a joy of being young and alive and with your friends, and you're trying to look good, and you're talking to other people and flirting, and you're doing all these things, and it's just joyfulness. I noticed in the last few years that I go to a football game on a Friday night and it's empty. Wow. People aren't there. I'll ask the students about it and they'll say, well, we're tired. It's the end of a week. I mean, they sound like they're 50 years old. And I say, well, don't you want to hang out with your friends? And they say, well, yes. And we are. We're just doing it on our phones. Talk about hollow. That connective tissue, like being in the same place with your friends at a football game. If you're in the band and you're playing the fight song together, or you rush the field when you win the Valley Championship, or you give high fives. I mean, just the physicality of friendship. I mean, just to be in the same space, to drive around in a car, listening to music, singing a song. I mean, I can give you so many examples from the beauty of our childhood. And you're right, that's not there anymore. Just 8 years ago, 2012, I guess 9 years ago, a majority of teens preferred face-to-face socialization, right? They wanted to be around other people. That is now 1/3. Only 1/3 of teens now actually favor that kind of social interaction. And I'll be honest, in my own house, sometimes I got to tell my daughters, get out of here, go do something. I mean, they have friends, but sometimes you got to push them to go out to the mall or something. And so it is sad when I think you compare it to kind of the childhood that you and I probably experienced.
Indeed, and I could relate to every one of the examples that you put forward, Jeremy. But I've got to ask you, what do you think are the societal implications 5-10 years down the line? Because if things aren't good now and they're going in the wrong direction, where do we wind up?
Well, I think that's a little bit beyond my pay grade. I'm willing to give it a guess, though.
Okay.
I can't see the future right now. I'll be honest. I feel like I'm never going to get out of COVID in the history of my life. It's never going to, we're going to go through the whole dang Greek alphabet,
Right.
of variants. But I will tell you what really worries me is the older I get, the more I really do believe that, at least for me, my happiness, my joy is really anchored in my relationships. The hard truth is that it's not always easy to be a friend. The hard truth is it's really hard to be married, even if you love the person a lot. Mm-hmm. The truth is it's really hard to be a teacher in a teaching community that comes increasingly at odds with your value system, or kids doing things that you don't understand. And so, you ask what's the long-term implication of a generation that doesn't know how to connect to things and doesn't know how to have relationships. I mean, you already see it a little bit. A lot of them are not. I mean, this generation, and there's a lot of good things about this generation, by the way. I feel like I spend my time, kind of bashing them, and I'm not. It's really you and me. We're the ones who are letting them do this. I feel like I've noticed they're not very good conversationalists.
Yeah.
They don't. A lot of them don't look you in the eye anymore. I've noticed that. You take that on 5, 10, 15 years. We already see that half of 18 to 34-year-olds don't have a romantic partner. We already see birth rates that are, sinking in this country. We already see loneliness because people don't learn how to be a friend. So all these things, I mean, dating is important. So you eventually, so you can figure out what works in a relationship. Who do I like? Who do I not like? What do I do that's annoying and I need to work on? You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. All those things about kind of how you acquire self-knowledge and how to be with people. And, kind of sometimes figuring out, this guy used to be a friend of mine, but I don't want to be their friend anymore. Or this person is a great friend and they need me and I need to sacrifice. It is worth it. I mean, all those millions of things about how to kind of thrive in the world. I see that being a real problem 5, 10, 15 years from now.
This applies to many other areas, Jeremy Adams. I think about something you reference in the book, this free fall in reading rates, that people are not reading anymore. And all of these things, if you don't acquire the skills, who's going to be around to pass them on, whether it's how you interact with people or some of the things you would learn from reading, or even to read itself. Like we used to get a newspaper in the afternoon or in the morning and just sit down and read it. That's gone.
I mean, you're talking to somebody who decided to make their whole career around the joy of learning. I remember, it's a great observation you make. I remember when I was in college, I was a freshman, and I really didn't like to read when I was in high school. I wasn't particularly, I was academic, but only because I wanted A's, because I wanted to go to a good college, because I wanted to make a lot of money someday. And if you want to make a lot of money someday, being a life of a teacher and a writer is not the way to do it. I just hope everybody listening to this podcast knows, if you want to make a lot of money, do not make my choices. That being said, though, I remember I was taking a class on political philosophy, and I remember reading Plato's Allegory in the Cave. It was so powerful to me, this idea that we don't control the convictions we have, that we're kind of born into a place, into a time in the world, and really that kind of imbues you with a worldview. It gives you a lens. It gives you all of the opinions you have. You didn't choose them. You just kind of, you make the same assumptions that everybody around you makes. That idea that, oh my God, I don't really know why I think what I think. I just think it because everybody else around me thinks. That insight of philosophy, that the philosopher is a lover of wisdom and will ask the difficult questions the way Socrates did, and is going to become very unpopular, right? Because they're making people question their assumptions. Not only did I love that idea, and it really kind of changed my life, but I remember thinking, the person who wrote this has been dead for 2,300 years. And here I am alive today, and somehow their words, Plato's words, is making a difference to me. And that's when I fell in love with learning and books, realizing that there's an entire universe of ideas and concepts that I have never even considered that can make my life better. My favorite quote on learning comes from the French writer Montaigne, who he invented the essay. And he said, "I study the thoughts of others to know my own thoughts better." Isn't that beautiful?
It is.
I study the thoughts of others to know my own thoughts better. Well, that you get that through reading, right? I mean, and that's why this is an important section in Hollowed Out, is because there are very few human activities that will widen your soul, that will enrich your worldview, that will give you a sense of mental fortitude than reading. I mean, there's not much else that can help you in your journey other than, learning how to learn. As you point out, reading rates have just absolutely bottomed out. You are more likely in America today to read a novel at 13 years old than you are at 17 years old because the devices have displaced all the time for reading. And also in the schools. I mean, I keep hearing about how children need to see themselves in what they read. I think the exact opposite. Our young people spend hours a day on themselves, on social media, taking pictures of themselves, posting, whatever. Actually, I don't want to see myself in the literature I'm encountering. I want to see a different world that I can enter into. So I'm just so sick and tired of people saying, we need to read literature where people see themselves. I think the exact opposite. We need to read literature where the self can be enriched, not reinforced.
I think a big part of the problem also, and you could speak to this from the classroom experience, Jeremy Adams, is the decline in attention span. I don't know what it is now, but I don't think many young people, maybe even many middle-aged or older people, have the attention span to read a book. I mean, it takes a little bit of a commitment. It's a great joy, and you get much more out of the investment. But do we even have the ability to pay attention anymore?
That's a great question. I feel it in myself. I feel like as a 45-year-old, I don't have the attention span to read the way I did 20 years ago. You're right. When you look at how young people spend hour upon hour upon hour, everything is very short. It's, a 25-second video. It's a Vine. It's a meme. It's an image. And they scroll. And, I have this problem with my son who, it's weird. I keep telling him, watch TV shows, read a book. I don't want you watching 3-minute YouTube videos all day because your brain will not learn how to take the time. And I actually write about this in the book a little bit about, there was a really great article in the Washington Post a few years ago by an academic. And he said, I'll read on a device. And yet, how when you look on the right over there, you can kind of see how much is left of the article.
Yes.
And he's like, am I almost done? Am I almost done? Instead of just enjoying it. And you're right. Reading a novel takes a commitment that we don't feel like making anymore. And I feel this in myself. I've never read War and Peace. I think you can tell by reading the book. I love Tolstoy.
Yes.
Right? Tolstoy is my favorite writer, but his most famous work I haven't read because it's 1,200 pages, and I think, well, I could read one book here, or I could do 50 other things in that time. I even see it in myself. So you're absolutely right. The attention spans are short. They're getting shorter. And that's why, you talk about homework. Young people, math teachers get crazy nowadays because they're like, okay, I'm giving you an hour of homework, and their students will come back and say, Mr. Whatever, this took me 6 hours. And what the math teachers are realizing is, yes, it took 6 hours because you'll do homework for 2 minutes and then look at your phone for 10.
I want to go finally, Jeremy Adams, to the deprecation of national heroes and patriotism. You discussed this in the book, and you had talked about the relevance of something to you that was written 2,300 years ago, and yet people are judging historic figures by modern-day standards and just throwing away their entire contribution to our society and to our world.
I would say of any intellectual habit that my kind of current and some former students have, this is the one that is absolutely the most maddening to me. I never thought it was particularly hard when I was growing up to understand that people who grew up in different places in the world in different times had a completely different worldview. And so a lot of the things that they did, a lot of their value system, a lot of their behavior was going to be, foreign to me. What you do is you kind of parcel out the good and the bad from people. And you can do that because you understand that we are all living in the stream of history, right? We're going to be judged in 100 or 200 years badly for something. I mean, I guarantee something that we don't even give a second thought to is going to look really bad in the year 2221, 200 years from now. I never thought this was a particularly hard concept, but for some reason, our young people today really do believe. A lot of them believe that if they were in a different situation 100 years ago living in Alabama or 200 years ago living in Mississippi or whatever, they would somehow be different than every single person around them. I usually am not a big fan of Bill Maher, but Bill Maher did a great kind of bit on this, those 6-minute monologues he does at the end of his show, where he says, you know what, if that's true, then right now, you tell me what people are going to be offended by in 200 years, and you start offending everybody you know by speaking out against that. If you really are that morally superior, then your behavior would dictate that. And yet what you see in young people is almost none of them are going to say anything or do anything that hurts their kind of social standing, that makes them stand out, that makes them look odd. They just want to be accepted like everybody else, like most people in history do. And so you can point out the good and the bad. And I don't understand why it's so hard to point out the bad and say there's still a lot of good at the same time. I'll give you a good example. I went to college in Virginia. Did you know that? I don't know. Yes, Washington and Lee. And, there's been this big debate at Washington and Lee about changing the name for obvious reasons, because, Lee was head of the Confederate Army and all of this. I understand it. I understand saying we don't want our institution to be associated with that element of Robert E. Lee. And I'm actually much more sympathetic to that than probably a lot of my more conservative friends. What's always been very clear to me, though, is the reason why they named it Lee is not because of anything he did during the Civil War. It's because he was president of the college after the Civil War. And he made a lot of good improvements to the college. That, to me, is a good example of we honor people for the good things that they do without excusing the bad. And that kind of middle ground, I think, is the right way to look at things. We all know that our John Marshall and George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, we all know that they owned slaves. We also know the extraordinary political achievements that they had at the same time. And I do worry about kind of saying because they did this, we should impugn everything they did. And I think that's nobody can stand up to that in history. Nobody. We will eventually be thrown out if that's our worldview.
Yeah, to my listeners, I often ask them to consider the movie It's a Wonderful Life, except with Thomas Jefferson, because Jefferson's under attack here in Central Virginia, his home, and say, what would this world be like if he had never existed? And I can guarantee you that it would be a much darker place. Yeah,
for sure. And I would say also, I would defend my kind of this. I understand where young people are coming from. What I think they would say back to me is, they would say, look, we see this evil in our past, and we want to be crystal clear about how intolerant we are of those institutions and those behaviors and those values. And if that means that we need to, rename some schools and take down some statues, isn't it worth it to do that so that our generation, because Jefferson said, the world belongs to the living, to each generation. They get to control things. We want to be very clear that we're not okay with that past. And so, I do understand that urge. And it's a very American urge, by the way. At the end of the day, what's so interesting about my students is that they have a thoroughly American, Jeffersonian, classically liberal sense of right and wrong, that they're the least likely to say that they're proud Americans. So it's kind of a weird duality.
Jeremy Adams, the book Hollowed Out, A Warning About America's Next Generation is so important, and I do encourage everybody to get a copy. Where can we get more information on the book or to purchase a copy of it?
Please go to Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com. My understanding is that my book is available physically, pretty much in any Barnes & Noble across the country. You can get it at Target. I don't know physically if you can go to Target, but you can go online, Walmart. Get it wherever you want. But please, I would just like to say to all of your listeners, I know that China and Russia are threats. I know the national debt is a threat. But if we don't get this generation right, then we're talking about the American experiment going awry. And so please read the book. Please share the book. This is a word-of-mouth book. I'm not famous. I'm not a politician. I don't have 1 million Twitter followers. I'm just a high school teacher. But I think if people read it and give it an honest chance, I think they will feel like, yes, this needs to be shared widely. So thank you so much for having me on.
That concludes another edition of the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Visit us online at shillingshow.com, where you can directly support this podcast by clicking on the Patreon banner at the top of the page and making a monthly donation. Your support is essential for the continuation of the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Until next time.